Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this independent audit webinar about subsidiary governance. And as we all know, it's not that simple. My name is Richard Sheath.
And I'm Jonathan Hayward.
Both Jonathan and I do a lot of work with boards. Many of you will be familiar with independent audit, but for those of you who don't know us, we're governance specialists. We do a lot of work on board effectiveness reviews, and also looking in depth at the effectiveness of committees. And also we look at the effectiveness of parts of the governance framework the board has to depend on, such as looking at the effectiveness of internal audit, the external audit process, risk management, risk culture, that sort of thing. And recently there's been a lot of demand for us to have a look at subsidiary governance and the role of subsidiary boards, or just to look at how governance is working across more complex groups. So we thought we'd share with you some of the thinking, some of the situations we've come across, and possibly some of the solutions. But before I go into that, just one practical point. If at any point you would like to ask a question, you can do that by using the chat box at the bottom of the webinar window on the right-hand side of your screens. Then to minimize that window so you get a better view, you can just click on the white arrow in the orange box. And if at any point you have a technical difficulty, do feel free to call our office, which is 020 7220 6580. But before we go into actually discussing the topic in hand, we'd just like to give you a bit of a flavour for who's actually listening into this webinar today. We actually had, much to our surprise actually, because it's quite a high number, we've actually got 150 people registering interest from 125 companies. And possibly what was really surprising to us was that we were expecting most of you to come from financial services companies. But in actual fact, only a third of you are from those companies, and 2/3 are from non-financial services. And also just to let you know that actually those registered, most of you are actually coming from group level. There's only around 14–15% who have actually told us that they're looking at it from a subsidiary point of view. And also possibly an interesting angle is that only around half of those of you who have registered are actually from listed companies. So that will give you a bit of a feel for the profile of the participants. So let's get on to the subject in hand. What we'll do is Jonathan and I will talk for maybe about half an hour, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end for any questions that you've sent to us. But it's a big subject, so it does need quite a bit of time, and there's a lot of complexities and variations. So right at the outset, we'll just issue a health warning in a sense, but this quick skip through the subject will inevitably be at quite a high level. And in particular to note that we won't today be dealing with the special complications of matrix management systems, where the legal entity isn't actually the business entity, and that's so much more complex and a whole topic in its own right. So there is a limit to what we can cover today, but hopefully this will at least give you a flavour of the main issues and get your thinking going. So if you just, I don't know what the objectives are today for this seminar. First of all, we'll just repeat the message through the independent audit style of using cartoons. It is complex, and it can't just be left to one person, and it's not just up to the board. One of the messages we'll be sending you throughout today is it really is a question of talking with people across the organisation who will be coming at things from different perspectives. It's not a one-man question. But in terms of the objectives today, what we're looking to do is to share with you a way of thinking through what subsidiary governance actually means for you, to give you a framework for thinking through those issues, to share with you some experience on the pitfalls and the sort of things that you might need to work out, and also give you a suggested approach. As I just said, obviously it's very complicated and we don't have any particular magic wand to use on this, but at least we'll share with you some possible approaches. We also just, before we move on at the outset, want to emphasise that what is key here is really working out the role of the governance structures before you move on to thinking through setting out the practical solutions. That's one message. And the second message we want to share is that whilst the principles are more evidently apply where you've got subsidiary boards, they apply just as much to management-based governance. And although boards certainly they do introduce an extra element of complexity, those of you who are not faced with that situation where you haven't got subsidiary boards and audit committees, the principles behind what we're going to be talking about still very much apply. Now, let's just explain what we mean by that. I'll be running through a few concepts and a couple of frameworks which you might find useful in thinking through the different angles and issues. And then Jonathan is going to be sharing with you some thoughts about the factors you need to consider and also some of the practicalities based on situations we've seen. But first of all, let's just set the context. Why is subsidiary governance becoming so much more of an issue? Firstly, I think one aspect is actually working out what's meant by subsidiary governance. It's an expression that increasingly is being used, but often means different things for different people in different organisations. So that's, I think, becoming an issue that more people are having to tackle.
It can also mean different things to people in the same organisation, which, of course, gives plenty of opportunity for confusion.
That's right. So you really do need to make sure you're talking about the same thing. But also, you're trying to work that out in a changing environment. What's needed from subsidiary governance is changing. And it mainly used to be a financial institution question because of the regulatory and the legal requirements of financial services operations, and also because of the risk and control angles. And so it was driven top-down from the board, driven in part by those regulatory requirements at both group and local level. And that's often resulted in local boards, and at times local audit and committees and local risk committees. And until recently, in non-financial services, the question of subsidiary governance was quite limited because the governance and the control has usually been explicitly through the management line. But now what's needed from governance is changing. Of course, it's more important than ever for the financial services companies, seeing into complex businesses, the multiple regulatory demands, the senior management regime, for example, is all driving a push to actually clarify how the subsidiary governance, how the governance across a complex group is actually working. So that means, but in non-financial services, in complex businesses, whilst it might still mean that governance is through the management line, there are increasing needs to get a much better insight into subsidiary operations and questions such as the sources of comfort for knowing that the organisation is controlled, more specific issues such as anti-bribery and corruption policies and processes and how they are being driven through the organisation. So that means looking at the purpose of subsidiary governance, the opportunities and the way it works and its effectiveness as well. Too often what we see is a lack of clarity, a lack of understanding, lack of purpose, wasted costs, a lack of visibility, inadequate two-way flow, all sorts of tensions emerging because of this, and missed opportunities as well. So when it works well, as well as giving strategic clarity and enabling people to focus on execution rather than these internal tensions, it can also act and add value from the assurance that is given to both the group level and subsidiary level over the activities and control, and also give more insight. So there's all sorts of benefits to actually getting this right. The question is, how do you go about getting it right? Well, first of all, we'd like to share with you some thinking on to help you work out, get the right slide up, help you work out what subsidiary governance actually means for you. We feel that you're going to be somewhere on a spectrum of subsidiary governance. So on the right-hand side, you've got a situation where the subsidiary board is fully in control. So just moving down the page in the grey box, which is pointing out it's probably a holding company situation with a dividend-based relationship, maybe with specific financial performance targets and payments, but with the subsidiary board having full autonomy. Moving leftwards across the spectrum, you've got a very different situation where the governance is fully through the management line. So move left and the amount of management control increases, move right and the level of board engagement increases. And you'll be sitting somewhere on that spectrum. And in between those two points on the right and the left, it's actually pretty complicated. Because in there you've got regulated businesses, joint ventures, merged entities, tax-driven structures, minority holdings, all sorts of added dimensions that are going to dictate where you're sitting on that spectrum. So we suggest that a starting point is actually to really think this through. Where does the management control sit? Where does what level of board engagement, or if any, you have? And where does that actually position you? Because, as we said, and you know very well, it's complex because you've then got additional angles to this, such as where the regulators get involved, and that can make the picture even messier. And it gets even more extreme when management still think they have the control, even though there's boards involved and the level of board engagement is relatively high. So that all just makes it even messier still. So it's important to have clarity around where you're sitting on that spectrum. Once you've done that, it can be useful, very helpful to have a framework to look at the flows within that structure. Now, what we're showing you here is just our thinking, our one possible framework that you can use to help you think through these different flows. And we have to emphasize that it is very much two-way. You've got flows going from group on the right-hand side into the subsidiary, and flows from the subsidiary into the group. And it can be helpful to think through what sort of categories of flows there actually are. You've got flows which relate to power, strategy, standards, behaviours, delegation, control, and some of the more detailed aspects were spelt out in this framework. Then that's complicated even further. It's not just a question of group flows into subsidiary or vice versa. You've then got management influence and control being exerted on this, and possibly also a set of regulatory expectations. So we're not in any sense suggesting that this is an easy solution. All it is providing you with that sort of framework to do your own thinking and to work out what sort of flows you have going across the group governance structure. And in doing that, you need to think of it through it at different levels. What I mean by that is, for example, it's not just a question of governance flows in terms of policy standards. It's also a question of management processes, tax considerations, accounting flows, culture, all sorts of different angles. So there's no magic solution, but at least this framework hopefully will give you something of a basis for having those discussions that you need to have to see different people's points of view, to tell for telling the governance story, and then moving on to more practical questions around, for example, terms of reference and working out the information flows and reporting lines. So, as I say, hopefully that gives you a bit of a framework, but at this point, I'm going to move away from the theory and pass over to Jonathan. He's going to talk about some of the practicalities, share some examples, and share some thinking on possible solutions.
So this slide sets out some of the things to think through. There's another one following it. Just give me a moment to take this in. Should we just put up the second slide, Richard, and then we'll come back to the first one. So these are all the sort of different angles of things that you need to get right. So if you just go back to the previous slide, please, Richard. Thank you. And the first few in here are perhaps the most important ones, because getting things right in this relationship between parent and subsidiary is the most important thing of all, is to get a good understanding of what the proper role of the local governance is. Most things go wrong at this level, in fact, we find. People haven't yet figured out an explicit understanding of why they are there, what the local government is governance is supposed to achieve, and how it fits with what the group is expecting to do through its management system. And these first few are pretty crucial to that. So let's just pick on one or two. First of all, share structure there. It's interesting how often we are troubled by, we find trouble by the parent company, a bit anxious that if it doesn't maintain control, if it gives any degree of autonomy to a local board, then that board will go off and do its own thing. But of course, under UK law, it can't. So if you are a subsidiary, your responsibilities in law are to act in the long-term interests of the company as a whole for the benefit of its members. I think I might have got this word slightly muddled, but I'm sure you all know what I mean. If you've only got one member, it all gets a great deal easier because you can actually get an explicit statement from that member of what constitutes success. And that then becomes a framework for the way in which the subsidiary should operate. And that simplifies, for example, strategy. A subsidiary company doesn't have the right to go off and decide that it wants to open up a whole new line and change from being a widget maker to a hamburger bar, because the parent company's definition of success will be around success as a widget maker. So there is clearly, that framework is in there, some constraints from group. Parent companies often need to have this explained to them. And of course, in different cultures, they may be less confident in the legal context here. I remember 20 odd years ago when I was working in Russia, one of my Russian bank clients had a branch out in the middle of Siberia, which one day just made a unilateral declaration of independence. And when the bank president went out to find out what was going on, he was met on the road from the airport by men with machine guns who told him to go home again. But that's not very likely to happen with a subsidiary here in the UK. And some degree of reassurance to shareholders is often simply needed for them to be willing to relax a bit and allow a bit more free thinking to the local governance. Another aspect of strategy is that at local level you need to recognise that you're not a complete self-contained agent. You are part of a portfolio of businesses owned by a group. And therefore, the group's, your members' definition of success is going to include success in the particular specialism that you bring to the party. So these are constraints on a board's ability to define strategy, but they are not in conflict with its duties as a board. And very often people have got stuck at this point, and they think that any constraint placed by a group is impairing their ability to fulfill their legal obligations. But of course, they aren't. These constraints are quite normal. One thing you always have to bear in mind is that almost all of the literature about corporate governance is written for parent companies. And you can't just apply that as it is to a subsidiary. You do need to recognise this sort of thing that I've just been talking about and bring it into your interpretation of what the board's duties are actually going to be and how they're going to play out in practice. Other important aspect, of course, is regulation. And in financial services particularly, you usually have a board because it's regulated. And it's really important, again, to build that into it. I mean, if the board exists primarily because of regulation, then it's not unreasonable for its role to be defined in largely prudential terms. That becomes the foundation of its role. It has to stop this board, this local entity, overreaching itself, taking too much risk, getting into trouble, and jeopardizing the fulfillment of the regulator's objectives. That's the minimum. Then it might as well look if it can do a bit more through advising on the local market and helping the parent to understand the business. And that brings it into perhaps having a usefully strategic role. But don't be afraid to define the foundation of its role as a prudential one, if the board is there because of local regulatory requirements. A few other things on this next slide that sometimes cause trouble. Assurance and risk management can be a source of real aggravation, and quite unnecessarily, in my view. It's a real storm in a teacup when there's a bust-up over this. Because it doesn't have to be a fight for control. The fact is that it's perfectly reasonable for a group to want to have assurance over the entire operations. It's also entirely reasonable for a local operation to want to have assurance over what it's doing. The key point here is that the levels of assurance may be different. At a local level, the materiality will be much less. So you might need more monitoring to actually provide the same level of comfort in relation to the local responsibilities. That's a critical point when you have a board, because it means that that board or its audit committee locally really need to be scrutinizing the work that's done by a group internal audit, and not just accepting that audit is something that will be done to them by somebody else. And the question of control then becomes a bit of a non-event, because the audit needs to have a duty to both parties, group and to local. If they're group resources, then they have to have an acknowledged responsibility to report to the local board or audit committee or to the local management. But the local management may also need to ask for more resource. And if group won't give it for one reason or another, then the local board or management should be contemplating whether it needs to acquire that assurance from some other source that it pays for itself. These needn't be controversial positions. They are just sensible ways of fulfilling everybody's responsibilities in that complex situation. Generally speaking, this sort of issue can just be solved by having a sensible conversation with people, acknowledging that you all have responsibilities and that they are all legitimate. It's not a question of trying to make somebody else's responsibilities subservient to your responsibility. It's a question of reconciling them. And my final thought on this is that in situations where you actually have local internal audit, the resources controlled locally, it is actually entirely reasonable for group to want to be getting assurance itself that the local audit is doing a decent job. If it's relying on that audit for assurance on a group-wide perspective, if it's part of the 3 lines of defence from a group perspective, then it needs to know that that audit is properly independent and doing its stuff. You get this sort of situation, for example, where you have local financial services subsidiaries as part of a non-financial services group. You probably have the subsidiary will probably have its own internal audit, or maybe in big groups, the local business here is big enough to have its own internal audit. So, all worth just trying to bring it together. And if you're having difficulty around this, there's no need to consult the lawyers. We'll almost certainly be able to fix it with just a sensible discussion that acknowledges everybody's legitimate responsibilities. I was an expert witness for FSA enforcement some years ago on a case that involved a sort of spectacular failure of controls at a UK subsidiary. And one of the clear issues there was that the 3 lines of defence were defined from the head office, and the UK subsidiary just got its share of what head office thought was appropriate, and it never queried it. And when you actually stepped back and looked at the amount of monitoring that was going on, it was nothing like enough to tell the local management, to give them the comfort that things were as they ought to be. So a very first-hand experience I've had of where management, local board, just got themselves into deep trouble by not taking a step back and saying, is group giving us enough comfort? If not, we need to get some more ourselves. Another area that's very commonly overlooked within groups is around shared services, sort of the internal outsourcing. It's actually easier, I think, to call this internal outsourcing rather than shared services, because it perhaps helps to define the relationship, the power relationship in this better. Shared services makes it, probably overstates the amount of influence that a subsidiary has. If you think of it as outsourced, it actually brings it down to contract and having proper structures in place to ensure that your needs as a subsidiary are communicated and understood and met, and proper accountability on the part of the service provider. And that's what you have to have in place. It's too easy for subsidiaries to just presume that the group will be well-meaning, will understand it, or indeed there is just their responsibility and not yours. But that won't help you if your systems all go down because of a massive cyber attack that you were assuming group was on top of. And you need to ensure that you have the protection in place, and in particular you've got the resilience yourselves in place to deal with it. So just thinking about the business continuity if you are let down by an intragroup provider, because it's your business that has to continue, and you can't just assume that somebody else is thinking about that. And perhaps finally, a point on information. It's really important if you're acting as a board at a subsidiary to actually get board level information. Terribly common problem is that because the management haven't thought very hard about what this board is for, they think of it as a management committee and they bring management information to the board, which sets the tone of the discussion at a management level, and either means that non-executives are unable to contribute very much, or it will pull those non-executives into discussion at too detailed a level. I'm always on alert as soon as I hear anybody talk about MI for the board. MI stands for management information, and a board should not be management. Board information needs to set out the risk exposures against the group and the local risk appetite, so the board can actually see the overall position. And it needs to be setting out the performance against the strategy. And that's actually back to an important point about that I touched on earlier around the relationship with the parent, which can be nervous about the group going off and doing its own thing. And part of reassuring it is to be properly accountable, which means having the measures to indicate what you are doing against the strategy, which is a group strategy, achieving that group definition of success, being able to show how you're performing against it. So there's a few more specific aspects of this, and we could sort of talk indefinitely, but that's probably enough for now.
Yeah, so we're just going to wrap up with the question of, so what's the solution here? Just going to share a few ideas with you on this. First of all, it's actually going to be a three-part slide when we get there. We're going to just see what you need to work out, then move on to putting together the framework, and then moving on to the detail. But in terms of what you have to work out, at the beginning, at the outset, really think through what are your governance objectives and what are the opportunities for good governance here. And where are you sitting? Where do you want to sit on the spectrum we showed you? If there are board structures involved, is it really clear what their role is? And if you're more driven by the management line of control, how does this actually form part of the governance framework rather than just the actual management and operational framework? What's it providing in terms of being a source of assurance? And how does it fit with the overall group governance structures? And how do these, if you have got boards and non-executives, how do those governance bodies, non-executive and executive, how do they actually fit together? And one clear message we'd like to give you in working that out is it's not something that you should do in isolation. It's not something that company secretaries get together and try and work out just by themselves. They've got to talk to representatives of other parts of the organisation, be they management representatives or representatives of the group at the ownership level, possibly other stakeholders such as regulators. So you really shouldn't be trying to do this in isolation. So, but once you have done that, put together the framework, put together, if you like, the story of how the governance works in your organisation with a clear, practical statement of the role of the subsidiary within the group governance structures. Think through all the practical consequences you can identify and all the different activities, really thinking through what actually needs to get done. And then work out who does what. It's not just about what the subsidiary has to do. It's also about what the group has to do, how the group has to work with the subsidiary.
That's a really important point, which is often overlooked. And I've seen cases where, for example, a group is saying that it wants a board to be a really effective board, but then actually it doesn't delegate the authority locally to enable the board to do anything very useful.
Yeah. So it's only when you've actually put that together, that framework, that you should then move on to the detail. Now, so often what we see is people have got sort of gone to the detail first, but you shouldn't start at the bottom. So it's not a question of starting from a theoretical position and working out in terms of reference and then moving on to the processes and information appointments without having done those two previous steps. Once you've done that, yes, then you can work on to that detail and work out also not only the practicalities around it, but also think through how you're going to make sure that the subsidiary board structures are actually effective. And answer the question, how far are you going to be able to rely on them? How far is group board going to be able to rely on them, group management? Or for that matter, how far are subsidiary boards actually going to be able to rely on the supporting governance framework at that subsidiary level? And also asking the question, what opportunities are there for it actually to provide more confidence, more comfort than there has done in the past? So part of that is that brings us to the question of how do you actually look at the effectiveness of the subsidiary structures? And I just want to mention an approach we take, which would provide you with a tool to actually enable you to do that, because I do think it's important to have a framework and to have a tool. And we've got one called Thinking Board, which some of you know about and have used, but we've actually got a subsidiary governance module for it. And it's designed, and I can't go into the detail on this call, but it's designed to actually give you very clear pictures of the opinions of people across the organisation on many different aspects of subsidiary governance and how well it's working. So that gives you these pictures, comparative pictures across different parts of the organisation, across different aspects of subsidiary governance, to help you identify the issues, raise and identify concerns across different parts of potentially quite complex organisations, to work out what's working well in some parts of the organisation and maybe not working so well in other parts. So we just mentioned that to you as a possible practical tool here to really help you identify what these issues might actually be. So we just want to now move on to some of the questions which have been raised by you. Jonathan's pointed out we haven't yet shared the final cartoon. So just pointed out that this is something which is constantly on the move. It's constantly changing, and some of you might recognise this as if you're on board, you have board in a complex organisation, you might recognise some of these behaviours now and again. But we'd just like to move on to the questions now. So somebody's raised the question, how could BT have avoided their issue with BT Italy, which is a clear failure of subsidiary governance? Well, I'll take that one. Jonathan, you've got another one coming through in a second, but just picking up this question of BT initially. Obviously, we don't know the details necessarily of that particular case or what went wrong. But I would suggest that it's a good example of really needing to work out the flows across the governance structures. And it's not just a question of group providing accounting manuals or group designing and implementing systems controls and group audit coming and doing a periodic check. It's a question of standing back and actually saying, for example, what is the flow in relation to culture, behaviors, expectations? How is group setting standards, and how is the information on local attitudes and behaviors actually going back into group? It's also a question of where does the oversight sit? Is it wholly dependent on oversight at the group level with only executive control and management, if you like, exercising oversight locally? Or is there something missing here in terms of a subsidiary level oversight body, whether that be executive or including non-executives, to actually ask some of the hard questions about the way things are operating at that subsidiary level? Another angle would be where the assurance is coming from. Is each critical part subsidiary across the organisation? Maybe it's not even critical subsidiaries, ones which could potentially pose reputation risk for the business. Where is the assurance coming from over the application of those controls? Where is the assurance over behaviours, ethical standards, culture? Because if you're solely dependent on a group internal audit function or group compliance function, internal audit being a better example, if you're solely dependent on that, doing periodic reviews every few years of particular aspects of part of the organisation, clearly the chances of actually servicing issues are going to be relatively limited. So you might need to look more closely at how assurance resource is distributed over the group and who locally is actually in a position to request more assurance or check that it's being applied in the right areas. Just one practical example I've seen recently in a FTSE 100 company, which might be worth thinking through, is actually the use of subsidiary audit committees. And that's at the, for example, at the business division level. These aren't necessarily audit committees that consist of non-executives. In fact, in this particular case, they don't. It's just that the senior executives in that part of the organisation have an audit committee. It's not just confined to people who are responsible for financial management, for people from across that part of the business. It's chaired by the group head of internal audit to bring that sort of independence and objectivity. And it's focused on looking at financial reporting controls, risk management, risk culture, assurance at that local level. And without wanting to suggest introducing even more complex and costly governance structures, it may be worth just thinking through how a group audit committee can get better assurance through using some form of subsidiary oversight body. Jonathan, have you got anything to add on that? Or would you like to move on to the next question?
I think you actually answered another question that was asked about any thoughts on conflicts of interest and how to monitor that local management are not running a parallel and possibly fraudulent activity against the interests of the group. Where I think what Richard's been saying is spot on. But basically, you need good reporting, you need good monitoring to give assurance, and you could very usefully augment that with a local board and/or audit committee, and preferably with the group level non-executives or even independent non-executives who are appointed by the group, and thus definitely free from any conflicts of interest. And I think that's probably going to be the best way of getting around it. Another question was about local and group assurance functions being in conflict over strategy or level of detail. Where does the decision get made? I don't think you should be approaching it as a conflict. I think it is just that there are two different sets of requirements around this, and they both need to be met. If somebody's being unreasonable, of course, they should be trying to be persuaded to be reasonable. But when you've got to a position where everybody is reasonable, then everybody has to be accommodated. And in my experience, in most circumstances, a sensible conversation will sort that out. Other questions come in about, is it okay for the executive committee to be delegated responsibility for some areas of subsidiary governance? for example, health and safety for all of the subsidiaries that are within that the scope of the Executive Committee's authority, and not left to the individual legal subsidiary boards. I think my answer there would be it's fine to leave the work to the Executive Committee, but the local board should still acknowledge that it retains a legal responsibility as a board for this, and it needs to be assessing how well the Executive Committee has been fulfilling it. What do you reckon, Richard?
Yes, I would just add to that that in a sense it should be seen as complementary. I mean, the point about one of the benefits of the local subsidiary board is that it is local. It's close to what's going on at that level. So whilst the Executive Committee might retain that responsibility for actually exercising that form of oversight, surely it needs to complement that by with the view built by the local subsidiary boards. So even though a local subsidiary board may be playing a different role in the organisation, in the legal structure, they are close to the ground, or have a view on, for example, health and safety in that part of the organisation. So why not share it with the Executive Committee? It sort of comes back to this question of flows. If the flows are working well between the different parts, between the group and the subsidiary, between the Exco and the local subsidiary board, and they're actually communicating and sharing their picture of what's going on in the organisation, that can only be beneficial. It can only help build a much clearer picture, which comes a bit back to the BT example we were talking about earlier.
And I think the underlying theme here, perhaps, when you're dealing with non-fraudulent circumstances, is that if you can have a proper understanding of the role and of the local governance responsibilities in relation to strategy, then you can get to a situation where everybody understands that you are all working to the same objectives. And in that case, you can all help one another, and everybody has a contribution to make. And the work that's being done at different levels is complementary, not conflicting.
Yeah. We've just got a couple of minutes left, and probably just time to squeeze in one last question, which is, with regard to the framework, if you were starting from a blank sheet, what would you do first? Well, I'm hoping that's been probably tackled by the question, this first step of the solution. Really work out where you are on the spectrum. Work out what your objectives are. Work out what role you want the different parts of the governance framework to place, and only then move on. Use the framework possibly as a starting point. And then work with others, talking with others. And I can't emphasize that enough. It's not a question, again, as I said before, it's not a question of sitting down with a blank sheet of paper in a room in the company secretarial department. It's a question of getting out there and talking to the people who are actually involved and who are actually affected by the way the governance structures are working. So the starting point is think about it, talk to people, and only then start putting things down on paper. Good. I think that brings us to the end of our time. Thank you all very much for participating. Obviously, we'll be sending you copies of the slides we used today, and so you'll be hearing from us. But in the meantime, again, thank you very much, and we look forward to being in touch. If you want to get in touch with us, our contact details, and hopefully one day we'll actually have an opportunity to meet face to face. Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.